Let's start another lesson by Olavo de Carvalho. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like to stay updated with all the content. So, let's get started. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Today, I'd like to comment on a few posts I made a few days ago that were overly condensed. Too condensed, really. I'd also like to take a moment to address this scoundrel, this bum, this disgraceful individual named Caio Fabio. Pastor Caio Fabio has claimed I'm training fanatics to seize power. What can you even say to such nonsense? The fanatic is you son of a bitch. I've advised my students to leave public office and dedicate themselves to intellectual pursuits. Only 2 remain in public service. Do you think I'm plotting to seize power with just 2 people? Seizing power is what you're after, isn't it? That's why you got involved with the drug trade, right? I know the story well, but I won't bring it up now. Were you associated with those people out of intellectual interest? Seriously? Moving on, I recently published a note that says something important. It's amazing how easily self-proclaimed conservative and Christian individuals accept as truth any defamatory anti-Olavian tale they come across. They never stop to question these tales. They take them as premises for conclusions they draw about what they imagine my thoughts are. They don't even bother verifying whether the tales are true or not. For example, the claim that Olavo is affiliated with the traditionalist school. I broke away from the traditionalist school in 1987. What is that, 3 decades ago? And I broke away in a combative way. They even filed a lawsuit against me, which of course they lost. That experience led me to decide that I would never again accept any guru. Up until then, I had considered the traditionalist school as a reference point, not necessarily as a belief of mine, because the traditionalist school is esotericism. It's not a religion, for God's sake. It's not tied to any particular religion. It proposes that you uncover a deeper meaning in religious texts and practices than you can find in mere exoteric practice. This kind of knowledge is absolutely essential. Without it, you won't understand anything about what happened in the 20th century. You cannot imagine the influence that figures like Guénon, Schuon, or Julius Evola had on the political world. You don't realize how much of an impact they had in the realm of high finance either. I've seen it with my own eyes. For instance, those connected to Schuon included Aga Khan, the wealthiest man in the East, who followed Schuon like a schoolboy. I witnessed this firsthand. From that time on, I had gathered enough experience and distanced myself from that school in an almost combative, scandalous way. Now, it's important to understand this. People who don't know how to read, who have no practice reading philosophical books, basically the vast majority of Brazilian commentators grab ideas I've developed over 50 years and mash them into a chaotic, oversimplified mess. They cannot conceive of intellectual evolution, which consists of successive intellectual experiences that you assimilate and eventually discard. While you're assimilating, you might temporarily accept an idea, but that doesn't mean you adopt it as an unchangeable belief. That's absurd. When someone reads, for instance, Plato, they might become Platonic during that reading. That doesn't mean they've adopted Plato's ideas as definitive truth. This is not how it works, except in the minds of those who have never studied anything. These people take things I read or wrote notes about 30 or 40 years ago, sometimes a mere journalistic piece without any personal commitment, and present them as if they represent Olavo de Carvalho's thought. The reality is, my intellectual thought only truly began with the works I published when I considered myself mature enough to publish them. My first book was released in 1994, The New Age and the Cultural Revolution. It wasn't even a proper book, just a thin little booklet. Serious works came later, The Garden of Afflictions and The Collective Imbecile, followed by Aristotle, in a new perspective. Starting from there, you can discuss the thought of Olavo de Carvalho. Before that, It was merely a learning process. I didn't even consider myself an author back then. I was just publishing journal articles and giving occasional lectures. The idea of presenting my own intellectual work only occurred after publishing The New Age and the Cultural Revolution. People who have never studied the intellectual evolution of any philosopher cannot grasp this concept. For instance, consider the philosophy of Schelling. Schelling had 4 philosophies. Is Schelling's philosophy only the final one? No. The earlier works were attempts. Learning, truth and error, dialectical confrontations, and so on. Similarly, Nietzsche changed his philosophy constantly. Eugen Fink tried to resolve Nietzsche's philosophical inconsistencies by organizing his ideas into a coherent system. Do you know what he found? 5 distinct systems. So what exactly is Nietzsche's philosophy? Clearly, it's only the last one, when he reached intellectual maturity. Professors who've never studied the evolution of any philosopher's thought are incapable of comprehending it. For example, those who study Karl Marx, take that famous group from USP, University of São Paulo, that became well known in Brazil. They were only able to read Das Kapital as a group. Individually, they wouldn't have managed. Even Karl Marx himself changed his philosophical stance several times. A serious issue arises regarding his early writings, such as the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844. Are these part of Marx's philosophy, or were they an abandoned phase? To this day, there's no consensus. Henri Lefebvre believed in a homogeneous evolution of Marx's thought, while Louis Althusser argued that Marx underwent a complete break, abandoning his early humanism for something entirely different. In philosophy, this kind of evolution is common. However, with Olavo de Carvalho, people flatten everything I've ever said or written into a single timeline. My intellectual development is ignored, as if I were somehow born intellectually fully formed. People even take the nonsense I wrote for Revista Planeta. Listen, Revista Planeta wasn't a serious publication, for crying out loud. They take anything I wrote there and integrate it into Olavo de Carvalho's thought. Some even say I'm a disciple of Evola. I've never taken Evola seriously in my life. I acknowledge his talent. He was an extraordinarily gifted man, but he was also insane. That's Evola's problem, not mine. Evola wanted to destroy the Catholic Church and restore the Roman Empire. What do you think of that idea? Isn't it utterly absurd? Of course it is. Evola started as a Dadaist painter and never completely left that mindset. I've never taken Evola seriously, not even for a single day. I can appreciate his talent. For example, his book, The Hermetic Tradition, is wonderfully written and demonstrates an extraordinary historical understanding of alchemy. However, he used all that as a stepping stone for his ultimate goal, restoring the Roman Empire. He even reversed the Hindu caste system, placing the warrior caste above the priestly caste. Why? Because he wanted to show he was macho. According to him, warriors are masculine, while priests are effeminate. So the macho caste must dominate. My God, what madness. Evola wasn't just insane. He had the ability to drive others mad too. My late friend Inácio da Silva Teles adored Evola. I don't know if he was a follower, but he had great admiration for him. When Inácio visited Italy, he wanted to see the Julius Evola Museum, located in Evola's former home. The experience was so disturbing that it left him with a chronic hiccuping condition, which eventually contributed to his death. Let me tell you what happened. He told me he called Evola's house, and guess who answered? Evola himself, despite being dead for 5 years. His death had been widely reported, and his funeral was attended by many. Yet, my friend claimed he spoke with Julius Evola over the phone. Then, he visited the house and had a conversation with Evola. To this day, I don't know what actually happened, but my friend was never the same after that encounter. Evola spent years writing about magic. He wasn't just an esoteric thinker, he was a sorcerer. And let me tell you, everyone who dabbles in that world is a bit unhinged. Some are extraordinarily talented, like Gurdjieff, who was a genius. But everything Gurdjieff wrote was madness. In his book Meetings with Remarkable Men, he claims to have invented perpetual motion in the second chapter. What more do you need? Gurdjieff would present his students with what he called his cosmological system. He'd take a piece of chalk, scribble equations on the blackboard and say, "This is the cosmological system. A plus b minus the integral of c equals y." His students would enthusiastically copy everything, believing they were finally understanding their master's teachings. The next day, Gurdjieff would erase everything and start over, presenting a completely different system. He created about 15 of these systems. The man enjoyed driving people mad. He was a wildly talented lunatic. René Guénon's work doesn't go beyond being a tool to Islamize the West. That's the essence of everything Guénon and Chouan did. When Chouan returned from Algeria, where he had undergone initiation, he declared, "I will Islamize Europe." And he did just that. What does any of this have to do with me? When I realized their work was purely about this agenda, of course, I broke away. You want to Islamize Europe? Fine. Good luck. I'm going to do something else. And what am I doing? Am I Christianizing the world? No, I'm not doing that either. Now, I'd like to touch on a fascinating topic: the history of ignorance. It's the history of forgetting, and it's absolutely incredible. I read about this in a book by Jean Fourastier years ago, and it had a profound influence on me. I came to understand that the history of forgetting is as important as the history of knowledge. When I began studying this perspective, I observed how certain debates lose sight of their object with astonishing ease. They devolve into an endless storm of nonsense. For example, I've always been interested in astrology and have followed the extensive astrological debates of the 20th century. Most people who discuss astrology haven't read a single word of these debates. They know absolutely nothing about the complexity or the high caliber of the individuals involved. In the 20th century, astrological debates were incredibly rich and sophisticated, yet no one seemed to distinguish between two key issues: the problem of astral influences themselves and the problem of astrological techniques. When someone asks, "Does astrology work?" I reply, that question is secondary. The first question is whether there's any relationship between celestial phenomena and earthly events. If such a relationship exists, then we can evaluate whether astrologers' claims are true or false. But you can't answer the second question without addressing the first. What I noticed was that a century's worth of debate had completely lost its direction. As a result, the question of astrology remains open. No one truly knows anything about it yet. People say things like, "Olavo is Bolsonaro's astrologer guru." I mean, this is childish, utterly idiotic, really, yet that's the narrative they run with. Olavo is using astrology to create fanatics, they say. My God, the level of stupidity is so low that it's not even worth debating. These individuals cherry-pick phrases and use them solely for defamation. That's it. There's no serious discussion about Olavo de Carvalho's ideas. Why? Because there's no one qualified to do so. In the entire Brazilian academic landscape, there isn't a single person equipped to engage with my thought, aside from my students. This is an intellectual situation so scandalous that even those responsible for it are ashamed of themselves and try to hide. They'll never enter into a discussion with me. Instead, they'll just hurl insults. They fight against a caricature of Olavo that they themselves created, one that aligns with their limited understanding. This is the intellectual misery of Brazil, and it's far more consequential for the country's destiny than all its economic, agricultural, financial, or pension policies combined. People don't understand this. Their view of Brazil's history is purely administrative, entirely focused on bureaucracy and accounting. Do they really think a country is built on such things? Isn't it absurd to have such a narrow, bookkeeping-like conception of Brazil? This level of discussion doesn't exist in any other country. Brazil has the lowest intellectual discourse in the world. Take, for example, our ministers. The smartest among them, Paulo Guedes, has an economic perspective, not just an accounting one, so he's a bit ahead of the others. But if you ask him about the psychological components of Brazilian society, he wouldn't know a thing because he's never studied them. These components are only found in cultural documentation, in literature, the arts, educational practices, and domestic morality. In all my life, I've seen only one book on Brazilian domestic morality, Mary Del Priore's A History of Childhood in Brazil. I was on the jury for the Fundação Joaquim Nabuco competition and awarded her the prize for this book. It's the only work I've encountered that delves into Brazilian domestic education. Is there anything more vital to a nation's formation than domestic education? What mothers instill in their children stays with them forever. Teachers' influence is comparatively superficial. To understand a country, you must first understand its domestic education system. Now imagine asking our Minister of Education what he's read on the topic of Brazilian domestic education. The answer would be nothing, and that's the end of it. You see the problem? We appoint economists who are simply there to distribute ministry funds, hand out money to various groups, and earn praise for being great ministers. That's how it works. If you look at all the individuals who've held the position of Minister of Education in Brazil, how many were actual educators? Perhaps one or two, at most, and they didn't accomplish much. Another striking observation: the sheer number of semi-illiterate individuals in Brazil who speak condescendingly about others is astounding. Why does this happen? It's all the fault of an institution called the university. Until the 1950s and 60s, Brazil had a vibrant and enviable intellectual and cultural scene. Publications like Revista Inteligência, the literary supplement of Jornal do Brasil, and the literary supplement of O Estado de São Paulo were proof of this. Magazines like Revista Leitura and Revista Brasiliense nurtured a vast intellectual community capable of engaging in global debates. Why did this vanish? It disappeared because university education monopolized all intellectual activity. What happens in university education? Those guided by their academic training tend to blindly believe that the discipline they studied is the ultimate science. Sociologists see everything as sociological, doctors as medical, physicists as physical, and so on. This specialization makes it impossible for them to achieve the intellectual breadth of earlier thinkers who read everything. Check out back issues of Revista Inteligência, which you can buy from second-hand stores online. You'll see the level of discussion back then. The participants were equipped to discuss any subject. If it wasn't their area of expertise, they would study it and assimilate the knowledge. University education, by contrast, confines individuals to narrow fields of specialization from the very beginning. They can never break out of these boundaries. But here's the thing: can any scientific discipline fully encompass reality? Absolutely not. No scientific discipline can fully grasp any aspect of reality because its object of study is abstract, not real. It's merely a conceptual slice of reality tailored to fit the methods of that particular science, and nothing more. Even attempts at interdisciplinary approaches fail. Why? because the real-world sense of experience has already been lost. Combining various scientific approaches doesn't recreate the real world. It's like cutting off parts of different people, a hand here, a foot there, a head, and stitching them together to form a Frankenstein. That's what intellectual life has become. Why is this happening? The division of academic disciplines doesn't align with the division of the real world. These academic divisions are just organizational constructs. A department of physics here, a department of music there. But adding them all together doesn't create a holistic view of reality. On the contrary, all of these fields originate from reality and cannot fully encompass it. What's needed is to recognize the existence of a general intellectual culture that lies beneath and above academic culture. This general culture trains intellectuals for public debate. Intellectuals must be open to knowledge from all sources, not just university science. They must also draw from folklore, public opinion, superstitions, and even wild theories. University-trained individuals, on the other hand, believe they've mastered their fields. When confronted with unconventional ideas, they dismiss them as superstitions or conspiracy theories. How do they know? Many ideas dismissed as conspiracy theories later turned out to be true. Take my discussion of the São Paulo Forum. Everyone dismissed it as a conspiracy theory at first. I won that battle because I was speaking the truth, based on real-world data and my own experiences. They, meanwhile, relied on their narrow academic frameworks. People like Paulo Roberto Almeida dismissed globalism as a conspiracy theory. Would he dare say the same thing today, now that globalist power has revealed itself so clearly? Do you see why my predictions are often correct, while the entire academic and journalistic communities are wrong? It's because they no longer understand what study or culture even mean. They've lost this understanding thanks to that disastrous institution called the university. Universities were not originally intended for this purpose, but as soon as intellectual work became structured around bureaucratic authority, it was game over. Culture can only flourish in environments free from intellectual authority. True intellectual authority is simply the respect earned by an individual's knowledge and insights, not mandates from a community. In every era, the most talented intellectuals hold sway as authorities, but not in the sense that a university department does. A university department can fire you. Can a writer you admire do the same? Of course not. True intellectual influence comes from personality and words, not bureaucratic or professional authority. When bureaucratic authority outweighs real talent, intellectual life ends. And that's what has happened in Brazil. The country is full of credentialed individuals, but they're barely literate.